They thought it was just another cabin tucked away by the lake. But for one black man, it wasn't just a getaway, it was his sanctuary. When the HOA stormed in, convinced they had authority over his space, they didn't expect what waited behind those doors. What started as an act of control quickly revealed something far bigger, something they never imagined. Why would a simple cabin visit leave an entire HOA speechless and change the way people saw justice that day? Hit subscribe for Join Our Community for years. Marcus cherished his quiet lake cabin. It wasn't a luxury or a show of wealth. It was a place where he could breathe. A simple wooden retreat passed down in his family. It carried memories of fishing trips with his father, long summer evenings, and a sense of peace away from the noise of the city. To Marcus, the cabin was more than four walls. It was proof that he had built something for himself, a sanctuary where he belonged. But as comforting as that cabin was, it also carried an unspoken tension. Marcus knew that being a black man in a predominantly white, HOA-controlled neighborhood often meant his presence was questioned more than welcomed. Still, he kept to himself, paying his dues, following the rules, and hoping to avoid unnecessary conflict. Yet, beneath the surface, the uneasy stares and whispered complaints never really went away. And on that day, when the HOA decided to push boundaries far beyond what anyone should, Marcus would find himself at the center of a confrontation he never asked for. What they didn't realize was that he wasn't alone, and who sat inside that cabin would change everything. It began quietly, with notices slipped under Marcus's door. Claims of violations that made little sense. Grass too long, paint too faded, vehicles parked a few inches over the line. Small things, yet repeated so often they felt more like warnings than reminders. Marcus knew the pattern well. He had seen how the HOA treated other residents differently. A white neighbor could leave tools scattered across their yard for weeks without complaint. But Marcus was called out for a single lawn chair left by his porch. The tension built slowly but unmistakably. Neighbors stopped waving. Conversations cut short when he walked by. Some even whispered about whether he belonged in a place like this. The cabin, once a safe haven, began to feel like a target. Marcus told himself to stay calm, to keep following the rules, to avoid giving them an excuse. But deep down, he knew the stairs carried an unspoken accusation, that his presence was the real violation. Then, the line was crossed. Without warning, members of the HOA showed up at his cabin one afternoon, pounding on the door. They claimed authority to inspect the property, but Marcus hadn't requested nor consented to any visit. Still, they pushed forward, acting as though his ownership meant nothing. The sound of heavy footsteps on his porch shattered the fragile peace he had built here. His heartbeat quickened, not just from fear, but from the painful familiarity of being treated as less than equal in his own space. The intrusion wasn't just about property, it was about control. About sending a message that Marcus didn't truly belong, no matter what the deed in his name said. As the door creaked open and voices echoed inside, Marcus stood frozen for a moment, the weight of history pressing down on him. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every time someone like him had been told they were trespassing in a place they rightfully owned. What the HOA didn't realize, however, was that Marcus wasn't standing there alone. Inside the cabin sat someone whose presence would turn their bold intrusion into a mistake they would never forget. The HOA barged into the cabin as if it were theirs to claim, voices sharp with authority, eyes scanning every corner like detectives on a mission. Marcus stood still, his chest rising and falling with a mix of anger and disbelief. He had endured their petty fines, their cold stares, their endless suspicion. But this was different. This was an invasion of his dignity, a reminder that no matter how much he built, no matter how carefully he followed the rules, they still saw him as someone who didn't belong. Their confidence filled the room until silence cut through like a blade. At the small table by the window sat a figure they hadn't expected, the state attorney general. Calm, collected, watching the entire scene unfold. The HOA's voices faltered, their bravado melting into uneasy whispers. They had crossed a line they could never walk back from. For Marcus, it was the rawest moment of truth. All the years of restraint, of swallowing frustration just to avoid escalation, now collided with the reality that he hadn't been powerless after all. Their intrusion was no longer just an inconvenience. It was evidence. Evidence of bias, of control, of an ugly truth too many tried to deny. As their eyes darted between Marcus and the Attorney General, the air thickened with a fear they hadn't anticipated. The people who thought they could strip him of dignity were suddenly stripped of their own authority, and in that fragile pause, one thing became undeniable. This was no longer just Marcus's fight. It was about exposing the truth they had tried so hard to bury. The silence inside that cabin said more than any confrontation could. The HOA members, once so confident in their authority, now stood face to face with the very person who upheld the laws they had chosen to ignore. Their intrusion, their bias, their reckless assumption, it was all laid bare in front of the state attorney general. What they thought would be an easy display of power had become a mirror reflecting their own prejudice. For Marcus, the moment was more than personal vindication. It was proof that years of quiet endurance, of trying to navigate life within a system stacked against him, had not been in vain. His dignity, so often questioned, was finally undeniable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth spoke louder than anything he could have said. But beyond one man's victory lay a deeper truth. This wasn't an isolated act of overreach. It was a reminder of how often people of color are forced to defend what should already be theirs: homes, spaces, peace of mind. The HOA's actions were not just about property. They were about control, and control rooted in something far uglier than rules on paper. When the story spread through the community, it carried weight. It made neighbors rethink their silence. It forced the question, if this could happen so easily to him, who would be next? And that's the reality that lingers long after this story ends. Because Marcus's fight wasn't just for his cabin, it was for the principle that no one should be treated as an outsider in their own home. So ask yourself, how many times has injustice gone unchecked, simply because no one was watching? And when the door is forced open, will we stand silent or finally speak? If this story touched you, don't just watch. Be part of the change. Hit subscribe and join our community of voices that matter.